The jogging shoes were still warm when they found her. In a town where the most exciting crime was usually teenagers spray painting the water tower, this detail would haunt everyone who heard it for the next 22 years. Something wasn't right about the scene at Copper Creek Bridge that October morning in 1999, but it would take decades before anyone understood just how wrong everything had been from the very beginning. Sarah Hamilton had been dead for less than 8 hours when deer hunter Bill O'Brien stumbled upon her body in the tall grass beside the old wooden bridge. The early morning mist still clung to the creek below, and the autumn leaves created a carpet of gold and crimson that should have been beautiful. Instead, it became the backdrop for Millbrook Township's first homicide in over 30 years. If you're following cases like this, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next reveals how small-town investigations can miss crucial details that only become clear with time. Sarah was 26. A kindergarten teacher who had moved to Millbrook just 2 years earlier to escape what she called the chaos of Detroit. She lived alone in a modest rental house on Pine Street, 3 blocks from the elementary school where children adored her patient smile and creative lesson plans. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, without fail, she would lace up her Nike running shoes and take the same 5-mile loop through the rural roads that surrounded the township. The route took her past cornfields ready for harvest, abandoned barns with sagging roofs, and eventually along the gravel path that led to Copper Creek Bridge. October 19, 1999, started like any other Tuesday for Sarah. She had taught a lesson about pumpkins to her 23 kindergartners, stayed after school to grade worksheets, and driven home in her red Honda Civic as the sun began to set. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Mendez, saw her arrive around 5:30 p.m. and waved from her front porch. At exactly 6:15 p.m., according to the digital clock on her microwave, Sarah left for her run. She wore her usual gear: black running tights, a bright yellow windbreaker, and reflective strips on her shoes. The temperature was dropping, but she had run in much worse conditions. The first sign that something was wrong came when Sarah didn't show up for work the next morning. Principal Robert Fisher called her house 3 times before driving to Pine Street himself. Her Honda was parked in the driveway, her front door was unlocked, and her apartment showed no signs of struggle. Her work bag sat on the kitchen counter, lesson plans scattered beside it as if she had been interrupted mid-preparation. The coffee maker was programmed to brew at 6 a.m., but the pot was still empty. Bill O'Brien had been hunting the same stretch of woods along Copper Creek for 15 years. He knew every fallen log, every deer trail, every place where the morning light filtered through the canopy in just the right way. When he saw the flash of yellow fabric through the trees, his first thought was that someone had dumped trash near the bridge. It wasn't until he got closer that he realized the yellow windbreaker was still being worn. Sarah lay on her side in a natural depression beside the creek, partially hidden by a cluster of oak saplings. Her body was positioned almost carefully, as if someone had wanted to conceal her but couldn't bring themselves to do it completely. There were no obvious signs of violence from a distance, no blood visible on her clothing or the surrounding grass. Her running shoes were still tied, her house key was still safety pinned to her jacket pocket, and her hands were clean. For a moment, O'Brien thought she might have collapsed from exhaustion or a medical emergency, but when he called her name and received no response, he knew he was looking at something far worse than a training accident. Sheriff Daniel Walsh had been preparing for retirement when the call came in at 7:43 a.m. At 58, he had spent most of his career writing traffic tickets, mediating neighbor disputes, and occasionally dealing with drunk teenagers. The most serious crime he had investigated was a string of mailbox vandalism in 1997 that turned out to be committed by a bored 12-year-old with a baseball bat. Homicide was something that happened in cities, something you read about in newspapers or watched on television. It wasn't supposed to happen in a place where everyone knew everyone, where people still left their doors unlocked and children rode their bikes until streetlights came on. The crime scene at Copper Creek Bridge challenged everything Walsh thought he knew about police work. He arrived with his two deputies, Mike Torres and Jennifer Quinn, and immediately realized they were all in over their heads. The township didn't have a crime scene photographer, so Deputy Torres used his personal camera to document the scene. They had no forensic kit beyond basic evidence bags and latex gloves. The closest medical examiner was 60 miles away in Grand Rapids, and the state police crime lab was backed up for weeks with cases from Detroit and other major cities. Sarah's body told a story, but it was written in a language none of them could fully read. There were no obvious wounds, no signs of sexual assault, no defensive marks on her hands or arms. Her windbreaker was zipped up to her neck, her hair was still held back in its usual ponytail, and her digital watch was still running. The only visible injury was a small bruise on her left temple, about the size of a quarter, which could have been caused by a fall or a blow from a blunt object. Dr. Martin Hoffman, the local physician who served as acting coroner, estimated she had been dead for 6 to 8 hours based on body temperature and rigor mortis. The lack of obvious evidence created more questions than answers. If Sarah had been attacked during her run, where was the struggle? The gravel path showed no signs of disturbance, no skid marks or scattered gravel that would indicate a confrontation. Her running route was well established and predictable, making her an easy target for someone who knew her habits. But the isolated location also meant there were no witnesses. The nearest house was over a mile away, and the bridge was invisible from any road. Deputy Quinn discovered the first potential clue when she examined Sarah's running shoes more carefully. Embedded in the treads of both shoes were small fragments of reddish clay that didn't match the soil near the creek. The clay was distinctive, almost orange in color, and unlike anything they found in the immediate area. It suggested Sarah had been somewhere else before ending up at the bridge. But where? The rural roads around Millbrook were mostly gravel or asphalt, and the few dirt roads were sandy rather than clay-based. The investigation expanded to include interviews with everyone who might have seen Sarah on her final run. Gas station attendant Carlos Rivera remembered seeing a woman in a yellow jacket jogging past around 6:45 p.m., but he was too busy with customers to pay close attention. Farmer William Carvalho was working in his field about a mile from the bridge and heard a car engine sometime after 7 p.m., but he couldn't see the road from where he was working and didn't think much of it at the time. These fragments of memory would have to serve as the foundation for an investigation that none of them were equipped to handle. As news of Sarah's death spread through Millbrook, fear began to settle over the community like morning fog. Parents started driving their children to school instead of letting them walk. Evening joggers abandoned their routines. The hardware store sold out of deadbolt locks within 3 days. Everyone had theories about what happened, but theories weren't evidence, and evidence was exactly what Sheriff Walsh desperately needed to find. Tommy Rodriguez had been living on the edges of Millbrook society for 3 years when Sarah Hamilton died, and in a town of 800 people, everyone knew exactly who he was. He rented a converted garage behind the defunct auto parts store on Main Street, paid his $30 weekly rent in cash, and survived on odd jobs that never lasted more than a few weeks. People talked about Tommy the way they talked about stray dogs, with a mixture of pity and wariness that kept him perpetually at arm's length from anything resembling community acceptance. At 29, Tommy had the weathered look of someone who had lived harder than his years suggested. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil and rust, his clothes carried the smell of cigarettes and cheap beer, and his eyes held the kind of restless energy that made people uncomfortable in checkout lines and church pews. He had drifted into Millbrook from somewhere in Ohio, or maybe Pennsylvania, depending on which version of his story you heard on any given day. What everyone agreed on was that Tommy Rodriguez was exactly the kind of person they expected to be involved when something terrible happened in their quiet town. Sheriff Walsh felt the community's unspoken pressure before anyone said a word. In the 3 days following Sarah's death, he received dozens of phone calls from residents who had suddenly remembered seeing Tommy near the creek road, or walking along the jogging path, or acting suspicious in ways they couldn't quite articulate but felt compelled to report. Mrs. Eleanor Gallagher swore she had seen Tommy watching Sarah during her evening runs, though she admitted under questioning that she couldn't remember specific dates or times. Gas station owner Frank Boyle mentioned that Tommy had asked unusual questions about the roads leading to Copper Creek Bridge, though he couldn't recall exactly what those questions were. When Walsh brought Tommy in for questioning on October 23rd, 4 days after Sarah's body was found, the interrogation revealed a man who was defensive, evasive, and seemingly incapable of providing a coherent timeline for the evening in question. Tommy claimed he had spent Tuesday night drinking alone in his garage apartment, watching television shows he couldn't name on a TV that neighbors later confirmed didn't work properly. He said he had gone to bed around 9 o'clock, but admitted he often lost track of time when he was drinking. His story changed slightly with each retelling, small inconsistencies that transformed him from a person of interest into the primary suspect. The physical evidence, however, refused to cooperate with the community's certainty. Tommy's fingerprints were not found on Sarah's clothing or running gear. His shoes, when examined by the state crime lab, contained no traces of the distinctive reddish clay found on Sarah's running shoes. A search of his garage apartment revealed nothing more incriminating than empty beer bottles and past-due bills. Most damaging to the case against him, Tommy's blood type didn't match a small sample found under Sarah's fingernail, though the sample was too degraded for more sophisticated testing with the technology available in 1999. Deputy Jennifer Quinn harbored private doubts about Tommy's guilt that she couldn't shake, despite the pressure from her colleagues and the community to build a solid case. During her interview with Tommy's occasional employer, construction contractor Pete Santoro, she learned that Tommy had been working a demolition job in Kalamazoo the week before Sarah's death. The job site foreman confirmed that Tommy had access to company vehicles during that period, including a pickup truck that was returned with unusual wear on the tires and mud caked in the wheel wells. But when Quinn tried to connect this information to the timeline of Sarah's murder, the details became frustratingly vague. As weeks passed, the investigation into Tommy Rodriguez consumed the sheriff's department's limited resources while generating diminishing returns. The state police offered assistance, but their involvement required paperwork and procedures that Walsh's small department struggled to navigate efficiently. Evidence sat waiting for lab analysis. Witnesses' memories grew less reliable with time, and the community's initial fear began transforming into frustrated impatience for an arrest that would restore their sense of safety and order. Detective Patricia Moore arrived in Millbrook 18 months after Sarah Hamilton's murder, assigned by the state police to review cold cases in rural Michigan counties. She was 34 years old, methodical by nature, and had spent 5 years working homicides in Detroit before requesting a transfer to less urban assignments. What she found in the Hamilton case file was a textbook example of how good intentions and limited resources could derail a murder investigation before it really began. The evidence room in the basement of the Millbrook Township building was more storage closet than forensic facility. Cardboard boxes labeled with Sarah's name contained items that had been collected but never properly processed, soil samples that had dried out and cracked, photographs that had faded from improper storage, and witness statements that raised more questions than they answered. Moore spent her first week simply cataloguing what existed, creating an inventory that revealed how many crucial investigative steps had been skipped or performed inadequately. The reinvestigation began with the reddish clay found on Sarah's running shoes, evidence that had been noted but never fully explored. Moore arranged for geological analysis that identified the clay as containing iron oxide concentrations consistent with deposits found near abandoned mining operations. The closest match was an area 15 miles northeast of Millbrook, where copper mining had ceased in the 1940s and left behind distinctive soil patterns. But when Moore visited the site, she found no clear connection to Sarah Hamilton or any obvious reason why she would have been in that remote location. Tommy Rodriguez had been released after 6 months of intermittent questioning, his status shifting from suspect to person of interest to someone who simply couldn't be eliminated or confirmed. By the time Moore took over the case, Tommy had drifted out of Millbrook entirely, leaving no forwarding address and no trace of where he might have gone. Tracking him became another dead end in an investigation full of promising leads that led nowhere conclusive. The Hamilton family's relationship with the investigation had deteriorated steadily as months passed without answers. Sarah's parents, Margaret and Robert Hamilton, had driven from their home in Ann Arbor every few weeks during the first year, meeting with Sheriff Walsh and pressing for updates that became increasingly disappointing. Margaret Hamilton was a retired librarian with a researcher's instinct for detail and organization, qualities that initially made her a valuable ally in the investigation, but eventually transformed her into what some officers privately considered a difficult obstacle to their work. Margaret had created her own case file, complete with timelines, maps, and copies of every document she could obtain through official channels and persistent requests. She corresponded regularly with forensic experts, private investigators, and retired police officers, seeking opinions and advice that often contradicted the work being done by the local authorities. Her theories about the case grew more elaborate and urgent as time passed, fueled by true crime books, television shows, and internet forums that promised solutions to mysteries that professional investigators couldn't solve. Detective Moore found herself caught between institutional loyalty and growing respect for Margaret Hamilton's dedication. The older woman's amateur investigation had uncovered details that the official investigation had missed. Sarah had received several hang-up phone calls in the weeks before her death, calls that were never traced or investigated. A convenience store security camera had recorded a vehicle matching the description of one seen near the jogging path, but the tape had been recycled before anyone thought to preserve it as evidence. These oversights weren't the result of incompetence, but of inexperience, small-town police work confronting urban-level crime. After 2 years of reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and following leads that ultimately led nowhere, Moore accepted a promotion that took her to Grand Rapids and a caseload that offered more hope of resolution. Her final report on the Hamilton murder case concluded that while several promising avenues remained unexplored, the available evidence was insufficient to support charges against any suspect. The case was officially designated as cold, though Moore kept copies of key documents in her personal files, along with a promise to Margaret Hamilton that she would continue thinking about Sarah's death even if she couldn't continue working on it actively. Margaret Hamilton had always been methodical. During her 30-year career as a research librarian at the University of Michigan, she had built a reputation for finding answers that other people couldn't locate, for connecting seemingly unrelated pieces of information into coherent patterns that solved complex reference questions. These skills, which had served her well in academic research, became both her salvation and her torment in the years following her daughter's death. The dining room table in the Hamilton home on Maple Street became Margaret's command center, covered with manila folders, photocopied police reports, maps marked with colored pins, and correspondence with dozens of law enforcement officials, forensic experts, and private investigators. Every lead, no matter how tenuous, received her complete attention. Every theory, no matter how far-fetched, was researched and documented with the same precision she had once applied to tracking down obscure historical documents for graduate students. In 2003, 4 years after Sarah's murder, Margaret hired private investigator Daniel Murphy, a former Detroit police detective who specialized in cold cases. Murphy's investigation cost the Hamiltons $12,000 over 6 months and produced a comprehensive report that reached the same conclusion as every official investigation: insufficient evidence to identify Sarah's killer. But Murphy's work also validated Margaret's instinct that crucial details had been overlooked in the initial investigation, giving her the confirmation she needed to continue her own research. The technological revolution of the early 2000s opened new avenues for Margaret's obsession. She learned to navigate online databases, joined message boards dedicated to unsolved crimes, and maintained correspondence with families of other murder victims across the country. Her computer skills, developed out of necessity rather than interest, allowed her to access newspaper archives, court records, and police department websites that had previously been unavailable to civilians. She created detailed spreadsheets tracking similar crimes in surrounding counties, looking for patterns that might connect Sarah's death to other unsolved cases. Margaret's relationship with local law enforcement had grown increasingly strained as her research expanded beyond their comfort zone. She regularly sent Sheriff Walsh and his successors packets of information about forensic techniques, investigative strategies, and similar cases from other jurisdictions. Her suggestions were always polite and well-researched, but they carried an implicit criticism of the original investigation that made official cooperation increasingly difficult to maintain. When Detective Moore left the case in 2002, Margaret lost her most sympathetic contact within the system, leaving her to work largely alone. The psychological toll of her decade-long investigation was evident to everyone except Margaret herself. Her marriage to Robert had survived Sarah's death, but struggled under the weight of Margaret's consuming need for answers. Friends stopped calling, social invitations were declined, and family gatherings became uncomfortable when conversations inevitably turned to Sarah's case and Margaret's latest theories about what might have happened. She had transformed from a grieving mother into something more complex and driven, someone whose love for her daughter had evolved into a relentless pursuit that defined every aspect of her existence. In 2009, 10 years after Sarah's death, Margaret made contact with Dr. Jennifer Costa, a forensic genealogist who had begun using DNA analysis combined with genealogical research to solve cold cases. Dr. Costa was intrigued by the Hamilton case, particularly the small sample of DNA that had been recovered from under Sarah's fingernail but had never produced a match in traditional databases. Costa explained that advances in DNA analysis might eventually make it possible to develop a more complete profile from the degraded sample, though the technology wasn't quite ready yet. Margaret's correspondence with Dr. Costa became a lifeline during the darkest period of her investigation. Costa understood the technical aspects of forensic science in ways that complemented Margaret's research skills, and their partnership represented the first time in years that Margaret felt she was working with someone who shared her determination to find answers. They discussed the case regularly, analyzing evidence from new angles and waiting for technological advances that might finally break the case open. The cardboard boxes containing Sarah Hamilton's evidence had been moved 3 times in 20 years, from the Millbrook Township basement to a county storage facility, then to a climate-controlled warehouse when concerns about evidence degradation finally prompted upgrades to the region's cold case storage systems. By 2019, the boxes were part of a larger initiative by the Michigan State Police to review unsolved cases using advanced DNA analysis techniques that hadn't existed when the crimes were originally investigated. Dr. Jennifer Costa had been working with law enforcement agencies across the Midwest for 5 years when the Hamilton case file landed on her desk as part of the state's cold case review program. The evidence sample that had frustrated investigators for 2 decades was smaller than a grain of rice, extracted from cells found under Sarah's left ring fingernail and preserved in a solution that had partially degraded over time. Previous analysis had been able to determine only that the DNA belonged to a male who was not Sarah Hamilton, information that had eliminated some suspects but provided no positive identification. Advances in DNA extraction and analysis had revolutionized forensic science in ways that seemed almost miraculous compared to the capabilities available in 1999. Techniques for amplifying tiny samples, separating mixed DNA profiles, and analyzing degraded genetic material had improved dramatically, driven largely by the demands of terrorism investigations and military casualty identification. What had been impossible 20 years earlier was now routine work for forensic laboratories equipped with the latest technology. The enhanced analysis of Sarah's evidence sample, conducted at the Michigan State Police Forensic Laboratory in Grand Rapids, yielded a partial DNA profile with enough markers to potentially identify a suspect if a match could be found. The profile was immediately compared against the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contained genetic profiles from convicted felons, arrestees, and evidence from unsolved crimes across the country. The search produced no matches, a disappointing but not unexpected result, given that many criminals had never been arrested or convicted in the modern era of DNA collection. Dr. Costa approached the Hamilton case with a different strategy, one that had been developed only in the previous few years and had already produced spectacular results in several high-profile cold cases. Instead of relying solely on criminal databases, genetic genealogy used public DNA databases containing genetic information uploaded by people researching their family histories. These databases contain millions of profiles from ordinary citizens who had submitted DNA samples to companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, creating an unprecedented resource for identifying individuals through their family relationships. The process was painstakingly complex. Costa uploaded the partial DNA profile from Sarah's evidence to GEDmatch, a public database that allowed law enforcement to search for genetic relatives of unknown suspects. The initial search produced hundreds of potential matches, ranging from close relatives to distant cousins several generations removed. Each match had to be investigated using traditional genealogical research, building family trees that traced genetic relationships back through multiple generations to identify common ancestors. Costa spent months constructing elaborate family trees for the most promising genetic matches, using census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries to map out extended family relationships. The work was tedious and often frustrating, requiring her to become an expert in genealogical research techniques that complemented her scientific training. She was looking for a pattern that would point to a specific individual who could have been in Michigan in October 1999 and had the opportunity to encounter Sarah Hamilton. The breakthrough came in March 2019, when Costa's analysis of a particularly strong genetic match led her to a family line that included several men of the right age who had lived or worked in the Great Lakes region during the late 1990s. One name stood out from the genealogical research: Kevin Fraser, a 47-year-old insurance adjuster from Cleveland, Ohio, whose work had required extensive travel throughout the Midwest during the period when Sarah was murdered. Costa's preliminary research revealed that Fraser had no criminal record and appeared to be a model citizen, making him an unlikely suspect, but someone who warranted further investigation. If you're following cases where cutting-edge science finally provides answers that families have waited decades to receive, you'll want to stay with us as this investigation takes a turn that nobody in Millbrook could have predicted. The connection between Kevin Fraser and Sarah Hamilton's murder was about to reveal how a single moment of violence could remain hidden for 20 years, protected by nothing more than the absence of the right technology and the assumption that killers always look like the kind of people we expect them to be. The genealogical investigation that would finally solve Sarah Hamilton's murder began with a genetic match so distant that most researchers would have dismissed it as irrelevant. Dr. Jennifer Costa found herself working with a DNA connection that indicated the unknown suspect shared a great-great-great-grandmother with someone in the public database, a relationship so remote that it required tracing family lines back to the early 1800s to find the common ancestor. But Costa had learned that in genetic genealogy, even the most tenuous connections could lead to breakthrough identifications when pursued with methodical patience. Working from her home office in Ann Arbor, Costa transformed her spare bedroom into a genealogical war room that resembled Margaret Hamilton's dining room command center in its obsessive attention to detail. Whiteboards covered 3 walls, filled with hand-drawn family trees that sprawled across generations like botanical diagrams of human relationships. Each potential suspect was assigned a different colored marker, creating a visual representation of genetic possibilities that grew more complex with each passing week of research. The initial genetic match had led Costa to the Morrison family line, Scottish immigrants who had settled in Ohio in the 1840s and whose descendants had spread throughout the Midwest over the following century and a half. Census records from 1900 showed 17 Morrison families living in Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, each representing a potential branch that could have produced Sarah's killer. Costa methodically researched each family line, using birth certificates, marriage records, military service documents, and obituaries to track the movement of Morrison descendants through multiple generations. The breakthrough came when Costa discovered that one branch of the Morrison family had changed their surname in 1923, when patriarch James Morrison legally adopted his wife's maiden name of Fraser after inheriting her family's small manufacturing business. This seemingly minor historical detail had created a genealogical blind spot that had concealed the Fraser family's connection to the Morrison genetic line, making them nearly invisible to traditional database searches that relied on surname matching. The Fraser family research revealed 3 men of the right age who could potentially match the DNA profile from Sarah's fingernail. Robert Fraser, a retired auto worker living in Detroit; Michael Fraser, a construction supervisor from Grand Rapids; and Kevin Fraser, an insurance adjuster based in Cleveland, but whose work required extensive travel throughout the Great Lakes region. Costa's initial background checks revealed that Robert Fraser had been hospitalized for surgery during October 1999, eliminating him as a suspect. Michael Fraser had solid employment records showing he had been working on a construction project in Florida during the weeks surrounding Sarah's murder. Kevin Fraser, however, presented a more complex picture. His employment records with Midwest Mutual Insurance showed a pattern of travel that had taken him throughout Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Wisconsin during the late 1990s, investigating claims for automobile accidents, property damage, and personal injury cases. His work required him to visit accident scenes, interview witnesses, and assess damage in remote locations, often working alone and maintaining flexible schedules that made it difficult to establish precise whereabouts for specific dates. Costa's research into Kevin Fraser's background revealed what appeared to be an exemplary life. He had been married to the same woman, Linda Fraser, for 18 years. They had 2 teenage children and lived in a modest suburban home in Lakewood, Ohio. Kevin was active in his church, coached youth soccer, and had no criminal record beyond a speeding ticket in 1997. His neighbors described him as quiet, reliable, and helpful, the kind of person who shoveled elderly neighbors' driveways without being asked and never complained about borrowing tools that were returned broken. The insurance company's records for October 1999 provided the detail that elevated Kevin Fraser from genealogical curiosity to serious suspect. During the week of Sarah Hamilton's murder, Kevin had been assigned to investigate 3 claims in southern Michigan: a barn fire near Kalamazoo, a multi-vehicle accident outside Battle Creek, and a personal injury case in a small town called Millbrook. The Millbrook investigation involved a slip-and-fall claim at the local grocery store, a routine case that would have required Kevin to interview witnesses, photograph the scene, and assess the validity of the claim. Costa's hands trembled as she printed out Kevin Fraser's work schedule for October 19, 1999. According to the insurance company's dispatch records, Kevin had been scheduled to conduct interviews in Millbrook on Tuesday evening, October 19th, beginning at 7:00 p.m. Sarah Hamilton had left for her evening jog at 6:15 p.m. and had never returned home. The surveillance of Kevin Fraser began on a humid Thursday morning in June 2019, conducted by Detective Lisa Rodriguez of the Cleveland Police Department in coordination with Michigan State Police investigators who had taken over the Hamilton case. Rodriguez had spent 15 years working undercover narcotics before transitioning to cold case investigations, and she understood the delicate balance required when investigating suspects who had been living normal lives for decades while potentially concealing unimaginable secrets. Fraser's daily routine reflected the suburban predictability that had made him invisible as a suspect for 20 years. He left his Lakewood home each morning at 7:45 a.m., driving a silver Honda Accord to the Midwest Mutual Insurance office in downtown Cleveland. His lunch breaks were spent at the same deli 3 blocks from his office, where he ordered the same turkey sandwich and read insurance industry publications while eating alone at a corner table. He left work promptly at 5:30 p.m. and arrived home by 6:15 p.m., unless his investigation schedule required evening appointments with claimants. The DNA comparison that would either eliminate Kevin Fraser as a suspect or transform him into the prime suspect in Sarah Hamilton's murder required a sample of his genetic material, obtained without his knowledge or consent in a process that pushed the boundaries of legal surveillance. Detective Rodriguez spent 3 weeks documenting Fraser's habits, looking for opportunities to collect discarded items that might contain his DNA. The breakthrough came when Fraser visited a Starbucks near his office and left behind a coffee cup that he had been drinking from for over an hour, ensuring that his saliva would be present on the rim. The laboratory analysis of Fraser's DNA sample took 6 days, during which Costa continued her genealogical research, while Rodriguez maintained distant surveillance of a man who might be a killer or might be an innocent victim of genetic coincidence. When the results arrived via encrypted email on a Tuesday afternoon, Costa read them twice before calling Detective Rodriguez with the confirmation that would change everything. The DNA from Kevin Fraser's coffee cup was a perfect match for the genetic material found under Sarah Hamilton's fingernail 20 years earlier. The transformation of Kevin Fraser from insurance adjuster to murder suspect required investigators to reconcile 2 seemingly incompatible realities. The Kevin Fraser who coached soccer and attended church on Sundays was the same person whose DNA linked him to the brutal murder of a kindergarten teacher in a town he claimed to remember visiting only once, for a routine insurance investigation that had lasted less than 2 hours. This cognitive dissonance would challenge every assumption about the nature of violence and the appearance of killers that investigators had developed over decades of police work. Expanded surveillance revealed details about Fraser's personality that took on sinister significance once his connection to Sarah's murder was established. Neighbors described him as intensely private, someone who maintained friendly but superficial relationships that never developed into genuine intimacy. His wife Linda later admitted that Kevin had always been secretive about his work travel, providing minimal details about where he was going or what he would be doing during out-of-town assignments. She had attributed this reticence to professional discretion rather than deliberate concealment. The insurance company's records for Fraser's October 1999 trip to Michigan revealed discrepancies that had gone unnoticed for 2 decades. Fraser had claimed 4 hours of overtime for his Millbrook investigation, billing for work that supposedly continued until 11 p.m. on October 19th. However, the grocery store owner he was supposed to interview had closed the store at 6 p.m. that day and had told investigators in 1999 that no insurance adjuster had ever contacted him about the slip-and-fall claim. Fraser had submitted a report claiming to have conducted extensive interviews and site examination, but the investigation had apparently never taken place. Hotel records showed that Fraser had checked into a motel in Kalamazoo on October 18th and had not checked out until October 20th, giving him 2 full days in the area with no documented activities or confirmed whereabouts. The motel desk clerk from 1999 was long dead, and security footage from that era had been recycled decades earlier. Fraser's expense reports claimed meals and gas purchases that placed him in various locations around southern Michigan, but 20-year-old receipts were impossible to verify, and the businesses where he claimed to have made purchases had changed ownership multiple times. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation suggested a man who had successfully compartmentalized his life, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while concealing aspects of his personality that his family and colleagues never suspected. Fraser's performance reviews at the insurance company consistently praised his attention to detail, his reliability, and his ability to work independently, qualities that had made him an effective investigator and had also provided him with the perfect cover for activities that had nothing to do with insurance claims. Detective Rodriguez's final surveillance report noted that Fraser appeared to be under increasing stress as the investigation progressed, though he showed no obvious signs of awareness that he was being watched. He had begun taking longer lunch breaks, spending time walking alone through Cleveland's downtown parks, with an expression that Rodriguez described as haunted. His conversations with colleagues had become shorter and more perfunctory, and his wife had mentioned to a neighbor that Kevin seemed preoccupied and had been having trouble sleeping. The arrest of Kevin Fraser took place on a Wednesday morning at 6:47 a.m. as he was loading his briefcase into his Honda Accord in the driveway of his Lakewood home. Detective Lisa Rodriguez had coordinated the timing with school schedules to minimize the trauma for Fraser's teenage children, but there was no way to shield Linda Fraser from watching her husband of 21 years being handcuffed and led away by police officers who read him his rights in voices that carried across the suburban neighborhood like a death sentence. Fraser's initial response to the arrest was a composure that unnerved the experienced investigators who had expected either denials or emotional breakdown. He listened to the charges against him with the same professional attention he had once given to insurance claims, asking clarifying questions about the evidence and the legal process, with a detachment that seemed inappropriate for someone facing life in prison. It wasn't until the interrogation room door closed behind him at the Cleveland Police Department that the mask he had worn for 2 decades finally began to crack. The confession came in fragments over 3 days of questioning, each revelation more devastating than the last. Fraser initially maintained his innocence, claiming he had never heard of Sarah Hamilton and had no memory of being in Millbrook on October 19, 1999. When presented with the DNA evidence, he shifted to suggesting the sample had been contaminated or that he might have unknowingly encountered Sarah at some point during his Michigan trip. But when investigators showed him the insurance company records documenting his falsified reports and unaccounted time, Fraser's carefully constructed defenses finally collapsed. The truth that emerged was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Fraser admitted that he had fabricated the slip-and-fall investigation as an excuse to spend extra time in the Millbrook area, drawn by what he described as an inexplicable urge to experience the isolation and vulnerability of rural Michigan roads. He had been driving aimlessly through the countryside when he encountered Sarah Hamilton, jogging alone on the gravel path leading to Copper Creek Bridge. What happened next, according to Fraser's confession, was a crime of opportunity that transformed an evening drive into a murder that had haunted him for 20 years. Fraser's description of the attack was clinically detailed, delivered in the same measured tone he had once used to describe property damage and personal injury claims. He had pulled his rental car over near the bridge and had approached Sarah under the pretense of asking for directions. When she had tried to continue her run, he had grabbed her arm, triggering a brief struggle that ended when Sarah fell and struck her head on a rock near the creek bank. Fraser claimed he had intended only to force her into his car, but Sarah's resistance and the isolated location had escalated the encounter into something he insisted he had never planned. The confession revealed the methodical mind of someone who understood investigation procedures and had used that knowledge to cover his tracks. Fraser had moved Sarah's body to the position where it was eventually found, had cleaned the immediate area of obvious evidence, and had thrown the rock that caused her fatal injury into the creek where it would never be recovered. He had changed clothes in his motel room, had burned the garments he had worn during the attack, and had created false documentation to support his fabricated timeline. Most chillingly, he had returned to his normal life within hours of committing murder, calling his wife from the motel to discuss their children's school activities with no trace of emotion in his voice. The psychological evaluation conducted during Fraser's confession painted a picture of someone who had compartmentalized his violent impulses so effectively that even he struggled to reconcile the person he had become with the person who had killed Sarah Hamilton. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the forensic psychiatrist who interviewed Fraser, noted that he showed signs of genuine remorse for Sarah's death, while simultaneously expressing pride in his ability to avoid detection for 2 decades. This contradiction, she concluded, reflected a personality disorder that allowed Fraser to function normally in society while harboring impulses that most people could never imagine acting upon. News of Fraser's arrest sent shockwaves through both Lakewood and Millbrook, communities that had to confront the reality that a killer had been living among them undetected for over 20 years. In Lakewood, neighbors struggled to reconcile their memories of the helpful man who had shoveled their driveways with the confessor who had described Sarah Hamilton's murder in emotionless detail. The courtroom in Allegan County was filled to capacity on the morning of Kevin Fraser's sentencing hearing, creating an atmosphere of collective catharsis that had been building for over 2 decades. Margaret Hamilton sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table, flanked by her husband Robert and their surviving son Michael, facing the man whose confession had finally provided answers to questions that had consumed her life since 1999. At 73, Margaret appeared smaller and more fragile than she had during her years of relentless investigation. But her eyes held the sharp focus of someone who had waited 22 years to witness justice for her daughter. Detective Patricia Moore had returned to Millbrook for the hearing, traveling from Grand Rapids, where she now supervised the cold case unit for the Michigan State Police. Her presence in the courtroom represented a symbolic completion of the investigation she had been forced to abandon years earlier, when limited resources and primitive forensic technology had made Sarah Hamilton's murder seem unsolvable. Moore's testimony during the hearing provided a detailed account of the investigative challenges that had allowed Fraser to escape detection for so long, highlighting how advances in DNA analysis and genealogical research had finally made justice possible. Fraser's sentencing hearing revealed the full emotional toll of a murder that had affected far more lives than anyone had realized at the time. The victim impact statements painted a picture of a community that had never fully recovered from Sarah's death, where parents had restricted their children's freedom, where evening joggers had abandoned their routines, and where the loss of innocence had lingered for over 2 decades. Principal Robert Fisher, now retired, spoke about the empty classroom that had never quite felt complete in all the years since Sarah's death, and about the students who still asked about the teacher who had loved them and then disappeared. The Hamilton family's statements were the emotional centerpiece of the hearing, providing a window into the psychological devastation that extends far beyond the immediate victim of violent crime. Robert Hamilton, speaking in a voice weakened by age and grief, described 22 years of wondering whether his daughter's killer was someone he had encountered in grocery stores or gas stations, someone who might have been living a normal life while the Hamilton family remained frozen in a moment of incomprehensible loss. Michael Hamilton spoke about growing up in the shadow of his sister's murder, watching his mother transform from a grieving parent into an obsessed investigator whose search for answers had consumed the family's ability to heal. Margaret Hamilton's statement was the culmination of more than 2 decades of pain, frustration, and determination that had defined her existence since the morning she learned of Sarah's death. Standing before the man who had killed her daughter, Margaret spoke not of revenge or hatred, but of the exhaustion that comes from carrying unanswered questions for 22 years. She thanked Dr. Jennifer Costa and the investigators whose work had finally provided the truth she had sought, and she spoke about her hope that other families dealing with unsolved murders would find similar resolution through advances in forensic science. Fraser's own statement to the court was brief and carefully prepared, expressing remorse for Sarah's death and acknowledging the pain his actions had caused to multiple families. He offered no excuses for his behavior and made no attempts to minimize his responsibility for a crime that had shattered lives across 2 states. His attorney's plea for leniency, based on Fraser's cooperation with investigators and his lack of prior criminal history, was met with skeptical silence from a courtroom full of people who had waited decades for this moment. Judge William Thompson's sentencing remarks reflected the unique nature of a case that had spanned technological revolutions, generational changes, and the evolution of forensic science from primitive evidence collection to sophisticated DNA analysis. He noted that Fraser's 22 years of freedom after committing murder represented a form of theft that extended far beyond Sarah Hamilton's life, stealing peace of mind from an entire community and condemning the Hamilton family to decades of uncertainty and pain. The life sentence without possibility of parole that Judge Thompson imposed on Kevin Fraser brought a legal conclusion to Sarah Hamilton's case, but the emotional resolution would take much longer for everyone affected by her murder. As the courtroom emptied after the hearing, Margaret Hamilton paused to speak with Dr. Costa and Detective Moore, 3 women whose lives had been connected by a commitment to finding truth in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. The story of Sarah Hamilton's murder and its eventual resolution through cutting-edge forensic science offers hope to families dealing with unsolved cases while serving as a reminder of the patience and persistence required to achieve justice in an imperfect system. If you've been following this case and others like it, we want to hear your thoughts about how advances in technology are changing the landscape of criminal investigation, and whether you believe other cold cases from the 1990s might be solved using similar techniques.